Hello, my name's Robin, and today I'm going to show you two images, and these images will form part of a video mock interview that I'm doing here. And this style of question is very common in Oxbridge History of Art admissions, and it's called visual analysis. And it is a skill, you can practice it and get better at it. And past the interview even, if you end up coming to Oxford or Cambridge or any other university to study history of art, visual analysis will be a very important part of your university level studies. It really just involves coming up with interesting comparisons between works of art. It's quite similar to maybe what you've done if you've done English A level, or actually even at GCSE, maybe comparing unseen extracts of poetry, that kind of thing. It's the same principle but for art, and today I'm going to show you not just art, I'm going to show you a piece of architecture as well, and that might seem daunting at first because a lot of people will not have had experience of talking about architecture in any way, and definitely not comparing it to a work of art, but that's quite important in history of art, and being able to think across mediums and across disciplines is really going to impress any interviewer. So I thought I'd start with this question. And first of all, I'm actually just going to show you the images themselves. I'm not going to give you a question. And just take 5 or so seconds to think and see if you can identify them. They're fairly well-known works of art and architecture. If you can, that's great. If not, no worries. I will, in due course, reveal the artist and architect, the year and the title of the pieces, which will help you in some way, but you may or may not get that information in an interview. I think it depends on who your interviewer is and the obscurity of the works of art they're going to show you. So here we go. Take 5 seconds or so then just to think, see if you can figure out who these may be by. And then I'm going to show you the question, which is, how does this artwork and this building relate to and interact with the environment around them? So how does this artwork and this building relate to and interact with the environment around them? Okay, so again, I'm just going to suggest you pause the video, have a think, go away, come back, and maybe try and find 2 or 3 points that you might be able to talk about at some length, and then I will give you a couple hints that might change your thinking, or if you've struggled, they might prompt finding that major point of connection between the two. Okay. So a hint for finding an answer is this: consider how you might view the subjects of these images if you were in the space that they exist in. So if you were in front of that building, if you're in front of that artwork, how would that really feel? What they look like, and how would your interaction with them shape the images themselves, shape the buildings, shape the artwork? Okay. So to give you a little bit further help, I'm now going to tell you the artist and title and year of the 2 artworks here. So the first is, of course, an Alexander Calder mobile. This one, his Eucalyptus, which he made in 1940. And the second is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Waterhouse, and I think my video might have just cut off the date there, but it was constructed between 1935 and 1939. So how does that now shape what you might be thinking, and whether you will have something else to say in response to this question? And before you do say anything in response to the question, I'm actually going to run you through how you should structure an answer, because I think it's quite important to be very clear in this. With anything that's comparative, you can often make the mistake of not talking about the artworks as individuals equally, or not even talking about them as individuals at all, and only focusing on the sort of crossover in the Venn diagram. But that is a mistake. I think you should at least show how you went about thinking about the artwork. So you must have looked at one of them first, okay, and say that. Show your interviewer the process behind your visual analysis answer here. Okay, So to do that, I would talk about image A first and go in strong with an answer. How does image A relate to and interact with its space? And do the same for image B. And then finally, after doing that, you can link the two. So really make that quite clear to your interviewer how you're structuring your answer here. And maybe this is what I would say for the first part, for the first step of this. I would probably talk about how if you look at this artwork from a different space in the gallery than someone else, you will both see different images here. If you're standing in front of a canvas, right, you'll see the same picture. But if you're standing at one side of this, you might, all of the forms might align and you might just see a single black line. But if you're standing in front of where this camera is, that this photograph was taken, you'll see all these forms laid out perfectly parallel with one another. And that is going to change how you view the artwork, of course. And that three-dimensionality is something to really focus on, and definitely when we're relating that to a building, of course, buildings are three-dimensional objects, so to try and focus on that when you're talking about the artwork is important. Things can be as basic as that, they're both three-dimensional, no? And then you go deeper into how that affects your viewing experience. And actually, other things that can affect the viewing experience that are linked to the space in which the artwork is installed is the movement of people and of air, and that affects the mobile moving itself. So this, of course, is a construction of various pieces of wire and these forms, these black forms in an abstract shape that come off those bits of wire, and they will all be able to move somewhat independently of one another. And how might that happen? Well, there could be an open window, there could be someone that brushes past the artwork. If it's a busy room and lots of people are moving, they're going to create gusts of air that spin the mobile, maybe different parts of the mobile at different speeds. It might not ever look the same as when you went to see it a week ago, let's say. So you have to think about how these artworks, how this artwork exists in its gallery space, and in that it's a static, not a static artwork, there are going to be different views of it depending on the time in which you view it. So that's how I would talk about this artwork in response to the space in which it sits. And to do the same for the house, we can talk about its interaction with the water. No, it's called the falling water house. And here the building is just perched above that water, almost as if the water is springing from the building itself. And then you might actually think that that is a nice way of integrating the building within its environment, within its space. You know, it doesn't interrupt the flow of the water. In fact, it suggests that it even produces it. But could we say something perhaps about the contrasting lines between the trees and the leaves and the flow of the water and the really heavy vertical blocks here that Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, uses? Those dominating yellowy concrete cantilever constructions at the front of the house here are very far from the nice leaves that we see in the foreground. So although this building does not necessarily interrupt the nature in a way we might expect it to, you know, it's unusual to build a house on top of a river. People don't do that normally, but here Frank Lloyd Wright has done that, and he's let the river flow through the house, but he's also made quite a strong statement with the architecture. It does definitely dominate the landscape around it. And then we can talk about the colour and the materials here. So you can see the vertical section is almost entirely made of stone, and that's obviously this kind of rough surface and that sort of silvery grey stone we can see mirrored in the actual geological foundations of the building. And then we can contrast that with, again, that yellowy concrete and how that does not necessarily find its place within the forest environment that the building is situated in. And then we can compare the two. So we can say, whereas Alexander Calder Mobile is a heavily mobile piece, Frank Lloyd Wright's house, although it accommodates movement through the water, it itself makes a strong statement of static identity and being a structurally solid unit. Those horizontal blocks are miles and miles away from the thin, wiry connecting pieces in the Calder Mobile. And that has an impact on the space, where the space is dominated, the woodland is dominated by this building, but actually the artwork is at the mercy of the space. The mobile is at the mercy of the space in that it's in. It is impacted by the people that visit the gallery, by the wind, the room. Can it spin freely? How is it hung? That kind of thing. Whereas even with the flowing water coming from beneath it, this house is unmoved. It is strong and it dominates its space. So you can kind of, like I said, like I did there, pull out evidence, specific parts like the wiry frame and the strong horizontal blocks in image B. And that's a really important thing to do in visual analysis. Pick out, like you might pick out a quote in English, right? Like you might find a quote in the unseen extract of poetry. Here you've got to quote your images, quote the artworks, quote the artist, find a specific place that illustrates your point, and explain it. And you might want to structure your answer with your main point, and then any secondary observations, right? So I spoke there about them being at the mercy of space, but then you might want to talk about how they interact with space in their material, in the colour, in the forms, right? We've spoken about that a bit. And then if you know the context of the artworks, then by all means mention it. So as you have seen from the previous slides where I told you the date at which these two, this building and this artwork were created, you can see they are roughly contemporary with one another, and they're both made by artists who were working in America at the time. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there are thoughts in America at the time about space and movement and how we as individuals interact with buildings and the spaces that buildings create, the spaces in which buildings exist. And Alexander Calder does the same thing to an extent. He produces an artwork here which defines its own space. It moves independently. It creates abstract spaces beneath it for us to imagine in an art gallery setting. And there's definitely a focus at the time in America on, that idea of American freedom, and this is represented, in these early years of instability in Europe through the war. This idea of American identity and American freedom is something which definitely comes to the fore in art and architecture. And this building and the artwork which discuss that movement could be said to be linked to that. And you might want to come up with something that is a little less tenuous maybe, or you might go even further. That is all good. If you can evidence your point using the images in front of you, then your interview will be more than happy. And just come up with some interesting thoughts. Think about the buildings and find things that I would not have found. Your interviewer will most likely have a specific answer in mind, a specific reason why they've paired the two images. But that is not to say that you cannot have your own. It's good to try and find what they're pointing you towards. But if you've thought of something they haven't, of course, mention it. And just evidence it. Be very thorough. And that's why I brought up how to structure your answer. Be very, very thorough with making it clear what you're talking about and where that fits into your wider argument. And that's hard to do in an interview setting, right? We have years and years of practice at school about structuring your argument on paper, but when we're talking, it's a bit more free-flowing. We can't always think ahead about what we're going to say and behind into what we've already said. So having a pre-planned structure about how you're going to dissect these two images and then compare them is really, really important. So I would suggest following that. structure. But that is the end of this video. I hope it was helpful. Have another think. You'll be amazed what you can find if you spend just another 5 minutes comparing the two images. There are loads and loads and loads of things to talk about. And if you want to practice this more, just find random images. They don't have to have some point of comparison, right? They don't have to be made in the same country. They don't have to be contemporary with one another. They can be any two images, and you'll be surprised as to what you can find with just a few minutes of thinking about them. So that is a short mock interview visual analysis question. I hope it was helpful. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much.